Hello.
Hi again. One of the unfortunate trends we've noticed in our comments section and the responses we get via email, etc., to the videos we've already posted is that a lot of ex-Jehovah's Witnesses tend to isolate themselves from community, and I guess that's inevitable, for some anyway, reaction to their disappointment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it does tend to look like paranoia. They go from not trusting 8 men in New York to not trusting
nobody
any,
or
themselves.
Just themselves.
So from 8 to 0, or from 8 to yourself, 1, is not progress. And we've done a lot of thinking about this over the years, and we wanted to lay some of the formative passages, passages that have meant the most to us, giving historical analogies both from the New Testament and from the Old as to what is God's antidote to disappointment and to religious chaos. Is it isolation, that is a direct download from God himself to the individual, or is it something else?
How to get past that fear. Just how we got past that fear, because I definitely had that fear.
You had it for sure.
Yes.
Not so much me, and there was a reason for that, which we've dealt with in some other videos. But here's a passage we haven't really spent any time on yet in our videos, and this is 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 1 and 2. Now concerning things offered to idols, we know that we all have knowledge. Knowledge puffs up, but love edifies. If anyone thinks that he knows anything, he knows nothing yet as he ought to know. Some translations say he doesn't know it yet as he ought to know it. What's the problem in Corinth that generates this response from Paul? Well, if you go back to chapter 1 and you're a Jehovah's Witness, you're familiar with the first problem he addresses in Corinth, among many, is Christians lining themselves up behind specific teachers. So Paul was one of them. And he says, some say, I am of Paul. Others say, I am of Cephas, that is Peter. Others say, I am of Apollos. Others say, piously, I am of Christ.
Right.
But apparently he doesn't even like the last one. He doesn't like people lining up behind him, nor Cephas, nor Apollos. And even those who say, I'm not of any of these, I'm of Christ. Well, they're kind of like the ones who you might think of as expecting God to do a personal download to you of all the wisdom that he has. And in Corinth, this is understandable, because this church is a brand new church. These converts to Christianity were all made within approximately 5 years before Paul wrote this. So you can understand that what amounts to a very childish view of how God should work. He works through me and my favorite teachers only. But we've been there, right? If we've been in the Watchtower, we've been in a cultic situation. You don't have to be in a cult to be in a cultic situation. So if this was something Paul had to combat in believers in the apostolic church of the first century, it all goes back to a scripture in my mind that you hear frequently when you're a Jehovah's Witness. And that is
Proverbs 18:1, which was used as an accusation against you when you stopped going to the meetings.
What did they say? How does it read in the New World Translation? Something like, one isolating himself will seek his own selfish longing.
Right. In the King James one that I'm reading from, it says, a man who isolates himself seeks his own desire. He rages against all wise judgment. Verse 2, a fool has no delight in understanding, but in expressing his own heart.
So it's understandable that when you're coming out of a cult experience like Jehovah's Witnesses, you would tend to seek protection or safety in isolation.
And in the case of the witnesses, because they don't read anybody or look to anyone besides the organization, they are isolating themselves. And that was your comment to my brother who had used this against you.
Yeah, I said to your brother that, through you, I said to your brother, the reason the proverb has been fulfilled in the case of the Watchtower, which at that point was only 2 to 3 million people and is now, as you know, 8 million or more,
Mm-hmm.
It's fulfilled in the Watchtower's isolation from any other source of wisdom but itself.
Mm-hmm.
And the most dangerous cults that have existed on this planet, the ones that everybody has heard about, such as Jim Jones and the Guyana massacre or suicide, they are extreme cases of what you see in the larger cults, which would include not only Jehovah's Witnesses but Scientology and Mormonism. Here you have thousands of reasonably intelligent people whose basic problem is isolation.
Mm-hmm.
Not isolation from community, because they have community, but
Yeah.
isolation from ideas that would criticize that community.
Yeah.
So in the book of Proverbs, you have over and over again the recipe to prevent us from falling into the trap of isolation or the mischief of wrong teaching. And the trap is not, the trap, I would say, for most of us coming out of a cult situation is isolation.
Mm-hmm.
It's not another system of wrong teaching, because we're kind of allergic to that by now.
Yeah.
But the assumption that God must work directly to me is not based upon New Testament or Old Testament.
And it's because you've been in one bad situation. Somehow you're fearful of falling into another bad situation.
Mm.
But you're preventing yourself actually from getting out of a bad situation. By not listening to anyone.
Yeah. So it's not so much a matter of us learning this from our own experience. We should learn it from the book of Proverbs and from the Old Testament in general.
Mm-hmm.
Because even if you think of the traditional conservative authorship of Proverbs, is most of it is supposed to be from Solomon. But think of how Solomon gained his wisdom.
It says he collected these proverbs. So
So
it wasn't that he authored them all, that he thought them all up. He was wise because he was listening to other people and collecting all these wise sayings.
And Ecclesiastes backs that up, that the pursuit of wisdom was his full-time job.
Mm-hmm.
And yet he was not, of course, able in the long run to sustain the wisdom he had, perhaps because of the power structure of Israel, him being king, etc. We don't know. But
Mm-hmm.
that's the way it usually works, that power corrupts. So what the book of Proverbs advocates, and Ecclesiastes backs up, and all Israel's history backs up, and then the New Testament itself, I think, supports this thought, that the safety is in community. Not because community is infallible, but because in the numbers you have the principle of Proverbs again being enacted, that one man sharpens another. As iron sharpens iron, one man sharpens another.
Mm-hmm.
If you don't have that sharpening going on, that sometimes hurtful or hurting criticism, then you
Or
only
corrective.
have self-criticism,
Which we don't do a lot of.
which most of us don't do. Yes.
Yeah. We need a corrective
Yeah.
aspect.
And it begs the question of, is God obligated to download wisdom to us personally? And in the Old Testament, we have no analogy to that. Don't forget that in the Old Testament and in the New, apparently, Scripture was heard. It was not read.
I mean-
You didn't have personal copies of the Word.
Again, Solomon. Solomon was promised wisdom from God, but it wasn't just dropped on him. It says he was learning by investigating everything, nature and
Nature, too.
animals, the plants, collecting proverbs. He didn't have it just downloaded.
So what does Proverbs recommend? I mean, we don't have to guess, and we don't have to look very far into Proverbs to see what it recommends as the wise course to avoid being, well, in the category of a fool. Proverbs 11, verse 14, for instance, says this: "Where there is no counsel, the people fall. But in the multitude of counselors there is safety." Now, if you're coming out of a cult again, you think in the multitude of counselors there's confusion.
Yeah.
That's what you experienced, although you didn't know it was confusion.
And you didn't think of it as a single, that you were isolated.
Yeah.
You already didn't think that. You thought you were in community by the people around you. But all of them are fed by the same source.
Yeah.
So that's not really community.
Now, our experience in the book business also confirm the truth of this, because we expected going into the scholars of Christendom that we would find confusion and disunity. But actually we found the opposite, and there's a reason for that, because most of the scholars of Christendom are living in and working in seminaries,
community.
universities, and churches where you're forced to help sharpen others, and you yourself are being sharpened by what amounts to what we would call criticism. In Christendom, you are allowed to criticize, and there's an excess of it in some contexts, but in cults, there's none of it.
So what we also found was humility.
Yeah.
Because of their listening to other scholars or other people, that would put in check their own positions. So we didn't find the arrogance, and we found a lot of humility, a lot of listening, and a lot of not asserting things as if I know and nobody else does.
There was constant reference to other scholars, so none of these are standing on their own understanding. None of them are trusting in their own understanding, nor that God is giving them superior knowledge
They're
to all
not
the other guys.
insistent that you follow and listen to them. They'll even present a different point of view.
So as we assembled this library of, for instance, books on the Gospels, the more I got, the more I was astounded by not just the humility of the writers, but the wideness of their sympathies and their openness to other points of view. They would take on other points of view and even critique them, but with graciousness, not with viciousness or judgment on people who perhaps came to different conclusions. And in many scriptures, it is possible to have several different viewpoints, because the scriptures are not nearly as clear as many of us would like them to be on many subjects.
They view listening to others as a means of gaining extra insights that you wouldn't get from your own history or your own perspective. But listening to someone else, you get it from a different approach, a different background of knowledge and experience. All put into it helps you to gain insight.
No, you don't need to have 5 or 10 commentaries on each Bible book, but in some Bible books it helps, because there's so much you can say, let's say, about Genesis or the book of Acts or any of the 4 Gospels. There's so much you can say, Revelation. You need multiple viewpoints. You cannot think there's only one explanation to a given text, especially in a dangerous book like the book of Revelation.
It's also a refresher. Every time you read another one, a different person, you're getting their style, their approach, and they might be talking about the very same thing as a previous one did, but they're giving you a fresh look at it.
Sometimes it's just in the way it's worded that jars your imagination and makes you think, I never noticed that.
Clicks with the way you think sometimes.
So in the next segment, we'll go deeper into what the book of Proverbs has to say about how we become wise. How will we become wise after leaving the watchtower?